This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, where researchers come to learn, innovate, and connect.
The way I view it is, as a researcher, it can be so hard to go beyond what the assets and the formulas supply. And especially when you're for ultra high net worth individuals, the higher the net worth, the fewer the visible assets. And the smaller those visible assets are as a proportion of the whole.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Adam Bradford, Director of Prospect Development at Columbia University in the city of New York. Hello, Adam. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
It's great to be here.
So before we jump into capacity ratings, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit about your career and how you found yourself in prospect research and development.
Sure. Yeah, I kind of fell into it when I moved to New York in my mid-20s and just needed a job. So I applied to the New York regional office of the University of Chicago, which is my alma mater. They always like to hire alumni, so it was very easy to get that job. I was an administrative assistant in their office for a few years, and then I eventually ended up becoming their office manager. So that was my first entree to development specifically. And then a researcher position opened up at Columbia when they were just beefing up their research department and adding a bunch of staff before a campaign. So I was part of that hiring wave and joined Columbia as a researcher. And I've been in the department ever since. Now I manage the team. So that's my story. It's pretty simple and not too many organizations involved.
That's pretty fabulous. You really found something you liked and you stuck with it.
Yeah, I've always liked research, and I was into genealogical research. I don't do it so much anymore, but I was really into it back then. And it's very similar to prospect research. You know, you're researching individuals, finding stuff out about them, and then compiling it. So I was kind of drawn to it and enjoyed the work a lot. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I happen to notice that in 2020, you presented at the APRA Prospect Development Conference. It was about capacity ratings. You did it with your colleague who was a data scientist. And in that session description, it mentioned that capacity formulas have trouble conveying uncertainty in the estimate. I'm wondering if you could just explain that a little bit, set the stage for us.
Yeah, that was my colleague, David Shemich. He's amazing. And it was really more his presentation. Because he's the data scientist at Columbia, or was, he's since moved on, but he built the model which we were discussing. And so that was the meat of the presentation. I was really there just to provide some context. So I don't think I wrote the blurb. So I don't want to speak for him necessarily, but I think what he was, in the context of that presentation at APRA, I think what he was getting at was the fact that, formulas tend to be based on models that are static or averages. And those formulas result in a very specific estimate. So regardless of what wealth inputs you have, you're always going to get the same estimate, even though multiple people with those same wealth inputs could have very different capacities. Nuance is lost. I would say it's actually not even uncertainty, but more like reality is sort of glossed over if you shoehorn people into particular formulas or static models. And then there's also an illusion of certainty that you get when you have a specific number, because we usually distill it into a single rating and it appears in writing. And so it seems very declarative and strong. This is what their capacity is. Whereas in reality, you don't know, you've guessed at it. It may be an educated guess, but that's the kind of thing that it's hard to convey with a traditional formula.
It's true that when we get a capacity rating back from our screening vendors, we get many times a range, which helps us understand it's not reliable, it's not specific, but then also that specific number, because in data science, in our databases, they want numbers.
You got to pick one. Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Well, they are a range, but you do have to pick a range. So, the way we do it, we have certain rating bands and we'll pick one. That's a range of gifts. But it's more like for any given individual, if you don't know what their actual net worth is or their actual capacity, and you need to try and guesstimate it. If you pick something specific, it assumes that you kind of know it. Really, what you're doing is foreclosing other possibilities and choosing one. And except for rare cases where you know someone's net worth, it is really a guess.
And gosh, if you knew their net worth, really, then you would probably be their accountant or wealth advisor, because even Forbes is way off.
Exactly. That's usually how the only way we know it. Like we do have some people in our database who, because they're giving a bequest, usually that's the reason they've divulged their actual net worth. And those are always very illuminating to learn about because you can see their career history and you can see how such a career led to them having certain net worth. So it gives you a lot of insight, I think, and helps you, I don't know, tether your rating estimates to something tangible. But they're so rare that they're just very unique. You can't really rely on it in general.
I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. When a prospect is making a planned gift, regardless of wealth that they have, there is many times this very close personal familial relationship with the prospect, and they open up their finances to the development officer. And I
Yeah.
remember working with a vice president of planned giving in Pennsylvania, and it was my first job as a researcher. I did some profiles for him, and he's like, Jen, this isn't terribly helpful because like I can sit down with their accountant or their advisor and I can see everything they have. I'm like, well, I can't do that. Now, had I only had your perspective on that way back then, I would have said, oh, tell me about that. And then I could have learned a little bit more about wealth accumulation.
Yeah, what you can learn is pretty limited, though. Like you want to be able to see representative examples of from like every field and every kind of trajectory. That doesn't work out that way. But there are other examples out there. Like whenever we'd run across them, and we'd like try to like make a note. Like we used to keep a file of them. When people join the government, in high positions, you've got to divulge your finances. That's always very instructive, and you do get some very high net worth people joining the government, so that can be interesting. But really, you can't rely on it, so you have to use other methods. But I always have my eye out for them, though, as like a check on my understanding.
Right. Like you said, to tether it. I love what you said about that because opensecrets.org is one of my favorite nonprofits, and they sort and filter and present political data.
Yeah.
And one of the data sets they've put together, they have put into a searchable format and understandable format when members of Congress have to disclose their wealth.
Yes.
And it's fascinating.
In many ways.
In so many ways. Okay, so part of the model that you and your colleague were working on, or he had created, was based on Federal Reserve survey data. And I'm not familiar with that. Can you explain
Right.
that?
It's hard to overemphasize just how dependent the model is on that data. I guess the best way to illustrate it is to compare it with what we were using before. We had formulas we used, and we still use them sometimes. And there was also this method which had been in use for quite some time of obtaining wealth surveys and using the data there as a way to estimate net worth based on wealth input. And the way we found the Federal Reserve data was just I was looking for an updated survey. So I just like started Googling, and that came up. And I was not looking for what it provided. I was looking for another company that did a survey that I could, purchase their analysis of. And instead, with the Federal Reserve data, what you get is actually no analysis, no value added, really. There's just a huge file of survey results. It's the raw data. That's what you can access with the Federal Reserve. And it goes into an incredible level of detail around the survey respondents' wealth. You can see what their net worth is, what their primary real estate is, secondary real estate, stocks, what's in their checking account, their savings account, how much of their assets are liquid versus non-liquid, and many other things, most of which we don't make use of. But, that's what's in the Federal Reserve data. And what makes it so valuable and why we created this model for it is that instead of using like a formula or like a model that you get with a typical survey where everybody in a certain net worth band is sort of shoehorned into an average, which is kind of a narrowing, of focus, you can take some wealth inputs that you have and compare them to this data set, which is actual people, who responded to this survey. And you can see in real life, people who have these assets that you've identified for your research subject have these net worths. So it's like actually the tethering, it's tethering your results to reality. Like you can see actual people who have those same characteristics and use that as a guide to rating. So that was the whole idea of using it. And what David built was a model that did that took all the data and essentially comparing your research subject to these actual survey respondents and seeing the full range of net worths that result.
That's amazing. I had
Yeah.
no idea that existed.
I didn't either. I was completely flabbergasted when I found it and was like, how did this? They've been doing it for a long time. I found it very interesting, as someone who just thinks about capacity ratings all the time to dig into it and see what it says. So
does it give any indication of what industry the person's in, like their occupation?
Unfortunately, it doesn't do that. There are a few things that are missing from it that could be useful. Yeah, there's nothing about industry. There's also nothing about geography. You can't get that granular with it.
It's just a huge step up from anything else available.
The way I view it is, as a researcher, it can be so hard to go beyond what the assets and the formulas supply. And especially when you're for ultra high net worth individuals, the higher the net worth, the fewer the visible assets. And the smaller those visible assets are as a proportion of the whole. And it's hard for researchers, myself included, to go past that and project wealth beyond what that suggests. So I see this tool as a way of, partially at least, as a way of helping researchers to move beyond that and also to have more confidence that when they are applying a rating, it's tied to something real. It's hard in research to get a handle on ultra wealth, what it looks like, because researchers aren't themselves that. They don't necessarily move in those circles. And so what does wealth look like what is accumulating it over time look like? The survey helps you kind of get a handle on that a little better. It's another reason I like it.
So this tool, this formula, this algorithm that's been developed, how can I get that?
Well, actually, the Federal Reserve survey data is really all you need. The survey provides the fundamental value. The data itself is of most value. The algorithm, which interprets it and extrapolates from it to give you a rating, has a lot of value added, but it's almost more of like a shortcut to analysis and just combing through the data. So one can still make use of that data without having the model on top of it. What I first did when I found it, before I started talking with David about it, is, I just downloaded the data into Excel and just started playing around with it. I created some additional data added on that lumped certain assets into categories and lumped certain ages into groups, lumped people in certain ranges of income. And then, I just created a pivot table in Excel. So all you need is moderate access to Excel and some like moderate Excel skills. And then I started looking up individuals. I was like, oh, this is what the information we have on them. And I just saw where they fit in the pivot table, looked at all the individuals who fit that description, and then just looked at the net worths and saw what they were. And anyone can do that.
It's a very clever and logical way of approaching this, what sounds like a very large data set.
Yeah. And I think the data set is pretty intimidating when you look at it. It's like any big problem. You just have to divide it up into bits and digest it. And we don't make use of most of it. I think there's a lot more we could probably do, one could do with it that we're not. We're at least doing the basics, but I think anyone could do it. Suppose you didn't even have a computer. Someone put this on your desk, you had this data set and you had your research subject and you knew these certain things about them. You could go through and you could like highlight each person who looked similar. And then later on, you could, look at all the highlighted folks. I think all these other tools are just like time savers really to get you to that. That's how much I value the data. And in addition to the model, which I think is important for people who may not have access to, may not know the R programming language and be able to construct something like that, or have staff on hand who are expert in it. You can still do something with it, I think.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing today. And it was such a great story to hear how it all came together. I really appreciate it.
And my pleasure. Thank you for having me on. Thank you for the opportunity.
That was Adam Bradford, Director of Prospect Development at Columbia University in the city of New York. I just loved his story. Seeking to improve, he stumbles over this incredible survey data from the Federal Reserve and immediately uses his Excel skills to put it into practice for capacity ratings. And immediately after the interview, I had to find and download the same data. You can too, because I've added the link to the show notes. Now, you may not know that Adam is also the 2022 president of APRA Greater New York. And if you want to know about topics such as stock analysis, cryptocurrency, international prospecting, and due diligence, well then, you had better hurry up and register for their hybrid conference, ProspectCon, on October 7th. You can register now at apragny.org. That's APRA, APRAGNY.org. Hey, if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come check out the Prospect Research Institute's learning community. It's a membership community with powerful resources, great discussions, and comprehensive courses. Check it out at member.prospectresearchinstitute.org. I'd love to have you join me as a member of the learning community. See you there.